January 18, 1943. Siniavino Heights, 30 kilometers southeast of Leningrad. The snow crunched beneath Major Pyotr Sokolov's boots as he approached the motionless beast. Steam rose from its engine deck, twisting in the sub-zero air like the breath of a dying dragon. Around him, Red Army infantrymen kept their rifles trained on the massive tank, as if bullets could somehow finish what the frozen bog had started. The Tiger I sat at a 30-degree angle, its right track buried axle-deep in mud that had refrozen overnight into concrete. Sokolov had seen plenty of German armor in the past year and a half: Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, the occasional captured wreck, but nothing like this. This machine dwarfed everything the Wehrmacht had thrown at them before. "Comrade Major," Senior Sergeant Viktor Orlov called out, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. The crew abandoned it. Hatches are open. No charges set. Sokolov felt his pulse quicken. An intact heavy tank. The Germans had been so desperate to escape the Soviet encirclement that they'd left their prize behind without demolition. He moved closer, running a gloved hand along the frontal armor. The metal was cold enough to burn through his wool glove. Even through the fabric, he could feel the thickness of the plate, far thicker than anything he'd encountered before. "Get Lieutenant Morozov from the recovery battalion," Sokolov ordered. "And find me someone who can drive this monster. We're taking it home." The recovery operation took 6 hours. 3 T-34s had to work in tandem, their crews rigging towing cables while engineers from the 502nd Separate Tank Battalion examined every inch of the Tiger. Lieutenant Alexei Morozov, a former tractor mechanic from Kharkov, circled the tank 3 times before attempting to start it. "The tracks alone weigh more than a T-60, Morozov muttered, climbing onto the hull. He disappeared into the commander's cupola, and for 5 minutes, there was only the sound of wind across the frozen battlefield. Then the Maybach engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. The sound was unlike anything Sokolov had heard before, not the high-pitched whine of Soviet diesel engines, but a deep, mechanical growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Black smoke belched from the exhausts as Morozov carefully backed the 60-ton machine out of its frozen trap. By nightfall, the Tiger was rolling through Soviet lines on its own power, escorted by a full company of T-34s like a dangerous prisoner being transported under guard. Soldiers stopped their work to stare. Some crossed themselves. This wasn't just a tank, it was a technological leap that made their own armor look like children's toys. Colonel-General Nikolai Voronov received the first report 3 days later at his headquarters in Moscow. He read it twice, then called for his chief ordnance officer. "They're claiming the frontal armor is 100 millimeters thick," Voronov said, sliding the document across his desk. "That's impossible. Our heaviest production tank has 75 millimeters. "Comrade General," responded Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Chesnikov, scanning the measurements, "our observers in the field have been reporting similar figures since November. The Germans call it Panzerkampfwagen VI. Tiger. It's been breaking through our lines in the south. Then we need to know how to kill it." Voronov stood and walked to the map table where the eastern front was marked with hundreds of pins. "Take it to Kubinka. Full evaluation. I want every anti-tank weapon we have tested against that armor. And Ivan, do it quietly. If the Germans find out we have an intact Tiger, they'll change everything." The Kubinka Proving Ground sat 60 kilometers west of Moscow, hidden in dense forest that had somehow survived the desperate winter of 1941. It was here that Soviet engineers tested captured German equipment, dissected foreign technology, and evaluated new weapons designs. Major Fyodor Petrov commanded the facility's testing division, and he'd examined dozens of German tanks over the past 2 years. But when the Tiger rolled through Kubinka's gates on January 29, escorted by NKVD troops and covered with canvas tarps, even Petrov felt his professional composure slip. "Mother of God," he whispered. His deputy, Captain Boris Kravenko, stood beside him with a clipboard, already taking notes. Weight estimated at 57 to 60 tons. Main armament appears to be 88 mm, probably the same flak gun they use against aircraft. "Against aircraft," Petrov repeated slowly. "They put an anti-aircraft gun on a tank chassis." The implications were staggering. The 88 mm flak gun had earned a fearsome reputation in North Africa and on the Eastern Front. It could destroy Soviet tanks at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. Now the Germans had mounted it on a mobile platform with armor that looked thick enough to shrug off anything the Red Army possessed. Over the next week, Petrov's team conducted a detailed examination. They measured every plate, photographed every weld, sketched every mechanical component. Engineer Captain Vladimir Abramov, a pre-war metallurgist, took samples of the armor for analysis. The frontal plate is 102 millimeters, Abramov reported during the team's first briefing. But it's not just the thickness. The Germans are using face-hardened steel soft backing layer, hard surface layer. Our shells will have trouble penetrating even if we hit square on. Petrov studied the photographs spread across the table. What about the sides? 80 millimeters. Still thicker than our heaviest tank's frontal armor. The rear? Same. 80 millimeters. The room fell silent. Every officer present understood battlefield geometry. Tanks were vulnerable from the sides and rear precisely because armor there was thinner a necessary compromise to keep weight manageable and engines powerful enough to move the vehicle. But the Tiger had no weak spot. It was a fortress on tracks. We need to know what can kill it, Petrov said quietly. Prepare for firing trials. I want every anti-tank gun we have brought to the range. The 45 millimeters, the 57 millimeters, the 76 millimeters divisional gun, everything. And get me shells armor piercing, high explosive, everything in infantry. Captain Kravchenko looked up from his notes. Comrade Major, shouldn't we preserve the tank for further study? After we shoot it. Petrov's jaw tightened. Our soldiers are dying because they don't know how to fight this thing. Every day we delay costs lives. We shoot first, study the wreckage second. February 3rd dawned cold and clear. The testing range at Kubinka stretched for 3 kilometers, marked with distance poles every 100 meters. At the far end, the Tiger sat positioned broadside, its hull perpendicular to the firing line. Soviet engineers had painted white circles on the armor to mark impact points. The first gun to fire was the 45 mm model 1937 anti-tank gun, standard equipment for Soviet infantry divisions. Sergeant Dmitry Volkov commanded the crew, veterans who destroyed their share of Panzer III during the defense of Moscow. Range, 500 meters, called the range officer. Target, frontal armor. Load armor piercing. Volkov sighted carefully through the scope. The white circle on the Tiger's front plate filled his view, centered perfectly. Loaded. Fire. The 45 mm gun cracked, its report flat and sharp in the winter air. Through binoculars, Petrov watched the tracer arc across the range. The impact was clearly visible, a bright flash, a puff of smoke. And nothing else. The Tiger sat unchanged. Hit confirmed, no penetration, Kravchenko announced, recording the result. Again. Volkov's crew fired 5 more rounds at 500 meters. Every shell hit the frontal armor. Every shell bounced away, leaving nothing but scratches on the paint. Close the range to 300 meters, Petrov ordered. At 300 meters, the 45 mm shells hit with more energy, the impacts ringing against the Tiger's armor like hammer blows against an anvil. Still nothing. At 100 meters, firing almost point-blank, one shell finally punched through not the frontal plate, but the lower hull where the armor tapered to meet the suspension. Penetration achieved at 100 meters, lower glacis, Kravchenko noted. Would likely damage transmission and suspension. Not a kill shot. Petrov lowered his binoculars. The 45 mm was the most common anti-tank gun in the Red Army. There were thousands of them scattered along the eastern front, defending every critical position. And they were useless beyond knife-fighting range. Next weapon. The 57 mm. The 57 mm ZS-2 was a more powerful gun, designed specifically to penetrate heavy armor. Its crews were fewer in number but better trained, and the weapon itself was respected for its accuracy and penetration. Surely this would be different. It wasn't. At 500 meters, the 57 mm armor-piercing rounds struck the Tiger's frontal armor with tremendous force. The impacts were louder, the flashes brighter. But when the smoke cleared, the tank remained intact. Only at ranges inside 300 meters did the 57mm begin achieving partial penetrations, and even then, the damage was inconsistent. "The Germans have changed the game," Petrov said quietly, watching another 57mm shell ricochet harmlessly into the sky. "They've built something our standard anti-tank weapons can't stop." The afternoon brought the 76mm divisional gun, the F-22, a versatile weapon used by both artillery batteries and mounted on KV-1 heavy tanks. This was the heaviest anti-tank weapon in widespread Soviet service, powerful enough to destroy any German tank encountered before 1943. The crew commander, a grizzled artillery sergeant named Pavel Sokolov, no relation to the major who'd captured the Tiger, had 20 years of service. He'd fought in the Winter War against Finland, survived the disasters of 1941, and helped break the German siege at Stalingrad. "Whatever you need, Comrade Major," Sokolov said, "we'll deliver it." "I need you to kill that tank," Petrov replied simply. The 76mm gun boomed, its recoil pushing the weapon back 3 feet. The armor-piercing round crossed 500 meters in less than a second and struck the Tiger's frontal plate dead center. The impact was spectacular, a shower of sparks, metal fragments flying. For a moment, Petrov thought they'd achieved penetration. "No breach," Kubinka reported. The round fragmented on impact. The armor held. They fired again. And again. At 500 meters. At 400. At 300. The 76mm rounds hammered the Tiger's armor relentlessly, each impact leaving a deeper crater, but never quite punching through the face-hardened steel. Finally, at 200 meters, a 76mm armor-piercing round struck the upper hull at a slight angle and penetrated. The shell disappeared into the tank, and a moment later, smoke began seeping from the hatches. "That's one," Petrov said. "But 200 meters is suicide range. A Tiger could destroy our gun before we got close enough to fire." As the sun began to set over Kubinka, painting the snow orange and gold, Petrov stood before the battered Tiger. Its frontal armor was scarred with dozens of impact craters, each one a testament to Soviet firepower and German engineering. They'd fired nearly 40 rounds from 3 different anti-tank guns. 2 had achieved killing penetrations. Both required ranges so close that the attacking gun would be destroyed by the Tiger's 88mm cannon before ever getting into position. "Tomorrow," Petrov said, "we bring out everything else. The 85mm, the 122mm, whatever we can find. This tank dies, and we learn exactly what it takes to kill one in the field." But as he walked back to his office through the darkening forest, Petrov couldn't shake a cold certainty: the Germans had built a monster, and the Red Army's current arsenal was barely adequate to stop it. February 4th arrived with fresh snow and temperatures hovering around -15°C. The Tiger sat on the testing range like a wounded animal that refused to die, its frontal armor pockmarked with impact craters from yesterday's trials. Petrov arrived before dawn, unable to sleep after reviewing the previous day's data. Captain Kubinka was already there, drinking tea from a metal cup and studying the Tiger through the morning twilight. "I counted the impacts last night," he said without preamble. 38 rounds fired yesterday. 2 penetrations. Both at ranges where the attacking gun would already be destroyed. "Today we use heavier weapons," Petrov replied. "The Germans can't have armored this thing against everything." But even as he said it, Petrov felt doubt creeping in. The Tiger's design wasn't just about thickness, it was about angles, steel quality, and sophisticated engineering. The Germans had clearly learned from 2 years of tank warfare and built something specifically to counter Soviet anti-tank doctrine. The first gun positioned on the range that morning was the 85mm air defense gun, model 1939. It wasn't designed as an anti-tank weapon like the German 88mm that armed the Tiger itself. It was meant to shoot down aircraft. But desperate times had led Soviet commanders to press anti-aircraft guns into ground roles, and the 85mm had proven effective against Panzer IIIs and IVs. Major Sergei Konstantinov commanded the gun crew, a team of 6 men who defended Moscow's airspace during the terrible autumn of 1941. They'd shot down German bombers, but they'd also engaged tanks during the December counteroffensive when the Wehrmacht had pushed to within sight of the Kremlin. "What's the target distance, Comrade Major?" Konstantinov asked, his breath fogging in the cold air. Start at 1,000 meters, Petrov answered. If the 85 millimeters can kill from that range, we have a solution we can deploy immediately. The anti-aircraft gun was massive, mounted on a cruciform platform that had been anchored into the frozen ground. Its long barrel elevated slightly as Konstantinov's gunner acquired the target. Through the rangefinder, the Tiger looked almost small at a kilometer's distance. Loaded, armor-piercing, the loader called out. Fire! The 85 mm gun's report was deafening, a thunderclap that echoed across the proving ground. The muzzle flash illuminated the snow in a brilliant yellow-white burst. Petrov followed the tracer through binoculars, watching it arc downward slightly over the distance. The round struck the Tiger's frontal armor with tremendous force, the impact clearly visible even at 1,000 meters. A shower of sparks erupted from the point of contact. No penetration, Kubinka reported, his voice flat. The armor held. They adjusted the range to 800 meters. Still nothing. At 600 meters, the 85 mm round struck with such force that the entire Tiger rocked slightly on its suspension, but the armor refused to yield. Each impact created a deeper crater, the face-hardened steel absorbing energy that should have punched through. Close to 400 meters, Petrov ordered, his jaw clenched tight. At 400 meters, firing directly at the frontal plate, the 9th 85 mm round of the day finally achieved what dozens of smaller shells could not. The armor-piercing projectile struck at a slight upward angle, caught the edge of a previous impact crater, and punched through. The sound was different, not the sharp crack of a ricochet, but a dull, tearing noise as steel gave way. Penetration! Kubinka shouted, actually showing excitement for the first time. 400 meters, frontal armor. Konstantinov's crew let out a ragged cheer, but Petrov remained silent. 400 meters was better than 200, but it still wasn't enough. In combat, a Tiger could engage Soviet tanks at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters with its 88 mm gun. Soviet gunners would have to close to suicidal distances to even have a chance of survival. Continue firing, Petrov said. I want to know if that was luck or repeatable. They fired 6 more 85 mm rounds at 400 meters. 3 penetrated. 3 bounced. The face-hardened armor was maddeningly inconsistent, its effectiveness depending on the exact angle of impact, the condition of the surface, even whether a shell struck virgin armor or an existing crater. Engineer Captain Abramov appeared at Petrov's side, his notebook filled with calculations. The Germans have done something clever with the armor tempering, he explained. The outer layer is incredibly hard, it shatters our shells on impact. But the backing layer is softer, more flexible. It absorbs the shock without cracking. We need perfect hits to achieve penetration. Or bigger guns, Petrov muttered. Or bigger guns, Abramov agreed. The afternoon brought the weapon Petrov had been waiting for, the 122 mm and 19-core gun. This was not an anti-tank weapon by design. It was a heavy field gun, meant to destroy fortifications and artillery positions at ranges exceeding 20 kilometers. Its shells weighed nearly 55 pounds, and the weapon itself required a crew of 9 men and a tractor to move. But if anything in the Soviet arsenal could crack the Tiger's armor decisively, it was this. Colonel Dmitry Volodin supervised the gun's positioning personally. He was a career artillery officer, 52 years old, a veteran of the Revolution and the Civil War who'd witnessed the entire development of Soviet armor doctrine. He studied the Tiger through a spotting scope, noting the previous day's damage. That tank has already absorbed more punishment than any vehicle I've ever seen, Volodin said quietly. Let's see if it can handle this. The 122 mm gun sat low to the ground, its massive barrel pointing directly at the Tiger 500 meters away. The crew loaded a concrete-piercing round not designed for tanks, but the heaviest armor-piercing ammunition available for the weapon. All personnel, cover your ears, Volodin ordered. Fire! The 122 mm gun roared with a sound that was less a noise than a physical blow. The concussion swept across the testing range, rattling windows in the observation bunker and sending snow cascading from nearby trees. A massive tongue of flame erupted from the muzzle, and the gun recoiled violently despite its anchoring. The 55-pound projectile crossed 500 meters in an eye blink and struck the Tiger's frontal armor like the hammer of God. The impact was catastrophic. The shell punched through the armor plate as if it were cardboard, the metal tearing with a screech that carried across the frozen landscape. A moment later, the interior of the tank exploded as the concrete-piercing round detonated among the ammunition storage, fuel tanks, and mechanical components. Flames erupted from every hatch, and the turret actually lifted slightly before settling back down at a crooked angle. For several seconds, no one spoke. "Well," Volodin finally said, "that's one way to do it." Petrov felt a mixture of satisfaction and despair. Yes, the 122mm could destroy a Tiger decisively. But the A-19 was a core-level asset, a strategic weapon. There were perhaps a few hundred in the entire Red Army, and most were committed to supporting major offensive operations. They couldn't be scattered among frontline units for anti-tank defense. "We need something between the 85mm and the 122mm, Petrov said. "Something that can kill this monster but can actually be deployed where we need it." "The 100mm naval gun," Kravchenko suggested. "We have a few at Leningrad. Get one here. Tomorrow." But even as plans formed, Petrov knew the larger problem remained unsolved. The Red Army's entire anti-tank doctrine was built around 45mm and 57mm guns deployed with infantry, with occasional 76mm guns for support. Now the Germans had fielded a tank that could shrug off these weapons like mosquito bites. Even the 85mm, which they'd proven could penetrate, required dangerously close ranges and perfect hits. "We need to count the kills," Petrov said suddenly. "From the beginning. Every penetration that would disable or destroy this tank in combat." Kravchenko flipped back through his notes. The 45mm achieved one penetration at 100 meters, lower hull. Probably not fatal, might damage the transmission, but the tank remains combat effective. So not a kill. What else? The 57mm, 3 penetrations between 200 and 300 meters. 2 lower hull, 1 upper hull. The upper hull shot might have hit the crew compartment. Might have. That's one possible kill. The 76mm, 5 penetrations at ranges from 200 to 500 meters. 2 definitely struck the crew compartment. 3 hit the engine deck and lower hull. So 2 kills from the 76mm, Petrov calculated. What about the 85mm? 4 clean penetrations at 400 meters and 1 at 600 meters. All frontal armor, all would have reached the crew or ammunition. So 4 kills from the 85mm. And the 122mm. Total destruction. Obviously a kill. Petrov did the math in his head. That's 8 killing shots. We fired. He paused, checking his own notes. 73 rounds total, from multiple weapons, at ranges from point-blank to 1,000 meters. 8 achieved what we'd classify as a combat kill. The implications hung in the cold air like frost. It had taken 8 direct hits with various anti-tank weapons to effectively destroy one Tiger tank under ideal testing conditions: no return fire, no movement, perfect visibility, unlimited time to aim. In combat, the ratios would be far worse. "There's more," Abramov interjected, approaching with fresh data. "I examined the penetrations. Even the hits that went through didn't always cause catastrophic damage. The Tiger's interior layout is clever. Ammunition is stored low and protected by additional armoring. The crew positions are well separated. You could hit this tank multiple times and it might still remain combat effective." "Comrade Major," a voice called out. Petrov turned to see Senior Lieutenant Yakov Orlov approaching, a dispatch case under his arm. Orlov served as liaison between Kubinka and the front, bringing field reports and requests for information. "I have reports from the Leningrad front. 2 more Tigers were engaged near Siniavino last week. And..." Orlov's expression was grim. "One was destroyed after being hit by artillery. A 152mm howitzer scored a direct hit. The second withdrew after multiple hits from 76mm guns. Our forces couldn't confirm a kill." Petrov absorbed this. So field results mirror our testing. These things can take tremendous punishment. There's more. Orlov opened his case and pulled out a sheaf of reports. Intelligence from prisoners indicates the Germans have Tiger battalions forming at multiple locations. Current estimates suggest they'll deploy at least 250 of these tanks by spring. Possibly more. 250 Tigers. Petrov felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February cold. If each one required the concentration of firepower they just demonstrated to kill, the arithmetic was terrifying. "We need to brief Marshal Voronov immediately," Petrov said. "And we need to accelerate development of heavier guns. The 85mm, the 100mm, whatever we can produce quickly." February 5 brought the 100mm naval gun. Petrov had requested a B-34 anti-aircraft gun borrowed from a destroyer under refit at Leningrad. The weapon was enormous, designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers and engage surface targets at sea. Using it as an anti-tank gun was improvisation born of desperation. Since the previous Tiger had been reduced to a burning wreck by the 122mm gun, engineers had to use the frontal armor plate from a second captured Tiger. This one damaged during recovery and towed to Kubinka as spare parts. They mounted the plate on a testing frame at 500 meters. The 100mm gun fired with a deep, resonant boom. The armor-piercing round struck the test plate and punched through cleanly, the penetration so decisive that Petrov actually smiled for the first time in 3 days. "That's our answer," he said. "The 100mm can kill at 500 meters reliably. Now we just need to build enough of them. And mount them on a chassis that can survive combat," Kubinka added. "The B-34 weighs 6 tons. We can't distribute those to infantry units. Then we put it on a tank. The KV-1 chassis can handle the weight. Or the T-34 if we modify it." But even as they discussed solutions, Petrov knew the timeline was against them. Designing a new tank destroyer, testing the prototype, establishing production lines, all of that would take months, possibly a year. And the Tigers were already on the battlefield, killing Soviet tanks with impunity. That evening, Petrov compiled his final report in his office at Kubinka. Outside, the February darkness pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the rumble of trucks bringing more captured German equipment for testing. His desk was covered with photographs of the destroyed Tiger, impact analysis charts, and ammunition expenditure reports. The numbers told a brutal story. 45mm anti-tank gun, ineffective beyond 100 meters. 57mm anti-tank gun, marginally effective at 200 to 300 meters. 76mm divisional gun, effective at 200 to 400 meters. 85mm anti-aircraft gun, effective at 400 to 600 meters. 100mm naval gun, effective at 500 plus meters. 122mm core gun, decisively effective at all ranges. But it was the final statistic that would define Soviet anti-tank doctrine for the rest of the war. Total rounds fired to achieve complete destruction, 73. Rounds achieving combat-effective penetration, 10. 10 direct hits. That's what it took to guarantee a Tiger kill using the anti-tank weapons currently available to Soviet frontline units. Not 8, as he'd calculated yesterday. Further analysis of the damage patterns revealed that 2 of the kills he'd counted might not have been immediately fatal. The tank could have potentially withdrawn and been repaired. 10 hits to kill 1 Tiger. Petrov wrote that sentence 3 times in his report, underlining it each time. 10 hits. And that was under perfect condition, stationary target, no return fire, unlimited time and ammunition. In actual combat, a Tiger could fire its 88mm gun once every 6 to 7 seconds. A well-trained crew could kill a T-34 at 1,500 meters. Soviet gunners would need to close to 400 meters or less with an 85mm gun, survive multiple shots from the Tiger's main gun and machine guns, then land multiple hits on a moving, shooting target. The mathematics were murderous. "Comrade Major." Kubinka appeared in the doorway. "The staff car is here to take you to Moscow. Marshal Voronov wants your briefing tonight." Petrov gathered his reports, photographs, and data sheets. As he stood, His eye caught the last photograph taken of the Tiger before the 122mm gun destroyed it, scarred, battered, defiant. A machine that had absorbed more punishment than any other tank in existence and remained combat-capable until overwhelming force finally broke it. "The Germans have raised the stakes," Petrov said quietly. "Now we have to match them or die trying." The drive to Moscow took 90 minutes through the winter darkness. Petrov used the time to rehearse his briefing, knowing that Marshal Voronov would demand specifics, numbers, and most importantly, solutions. The Red Army was planning major offensives for the spring. Those operations couldn't succeed if Tigers could shred Soviet armor with impunity. At Red Army headquarters, Petrov was ushered directly into Voronov's office. The Marshal sat behind a desk covered with maps, reports, and intelligence summaries. Two other officers were present: Major General Anatoly Nikolaev from the Main Armor Directorate and Colonel Alexander Morozov, chief designer at Factory No. 183 in Nizhny Tagil. "Major Petrov," Voronov said without preamble, "tell me you found a way to kill this German monster." Petrov laid out his findings methodically: the test results, the ammunition expenditures, the grim arithmetic of Tiger combat. He saved the worst news for last. 10 hits, Comrade Marshal. That's what it takes with our current weapons to guarantee a kill. 10 direct hits at close range. The room fell silent. 10, Voronov repeated slowly. And how many hits can the Tiger deliver in that same time frame? Its rate of fire is approximately 8 to 10 rounds per minute, Comrade Marshal. Effective range against our tanks is 1,500 meters or more. Nikolaev leaned forward. So by the time one of our guns closes to effective range and fires 10 times, the Tiger will have destroyed multiple Soviet tanks. Yes, Comrade General. That's the situation. Then we need new tanks, Morozov said bluntly. The T-34's 76mm gun is obsolete against this armor. We need the 85mm variant in production immediately. The T-34-85 won't be ready until late this year, Nikolaev countered. What do we do in the meantime? Voronov stood and walked to the map of the Eastern Front. Red pins marked Soviet positions. Black pins marked German formations. Several black pins were labeled with tank symbols: Tigers. "Major Petrov," Voronov said, "your report will be distributed to every tank commander, every artillery officer, every infantry general in the Red Army. They need to know what they're facing. But more importantly, they need to know the tactics to kill it." "Tactics, Comrade Marshal?" "Yes. If we can't match the Tiger's armor or firepower immediately, we overwhelm it with numbers and coordination. Concentrate fire from multiple guns simultaneously. Attack from multiple angles to expose weaker armor. Use infantry to close with explosives. Air support to suppress the crew. Whatever works." It was a brutal calculus, trading Soviet lives and equipment for German technological superiority. But Petrov understood the logic. The Red Army had millions of men, thousands of tanks, and the industrial capacity to replace losses. The Germans had perhaps 250 Tigers, each one a masterpiece of engineering but irreplaceable if destroyed. "There's one more thing, Comrade Marshal," Petrov added. "The Germans made mistakes. The Tiger is too heavy, it breaks bridges and gets stuck in mud. Its transmission is complex and prone to failure. The engine requires constant maintenance. It's a formidable weapon, but it's not invincible. It can be killed." "Just not easily," Voronov finished. "No, Comrade Marshal. Not easily at all." February 12, 1943. Voronezh Front Headquarters, 400 kilometers south of Moscow. Lieutenant General Nikolai Voronov read Petrov's report 3 times before calling his staff together. Outside his command bunker, the spring thaw was beginning early, turning roads into rivers of mud. The Voronezh front had been bleeding since January, trading ground and men to slow German armored counterattacks following the Soviet victory at Stalingrad. And now this. Tigers. "Gentlemen," Voronov addressed the dozen officers crowded into the briefing room, "I want to read you something from Major Petrov at Kubinka Proving Ground." He adjusted his reading glasses. The Panzerkampfwagen VI Tiger represents a fundamental shift in armored warfare. Current Soviet anti-tank weapons are inadequate against its frontal armor at combat ranges. Destroying a single Tiger requires concentrated fire from multiple weapons, preferably 85 mm or larger, at ranges of 400 meters or less. Colonel Ivan Chistyakov, commander of the 6th Guards Tank Corps, interrupted. 400 meters? Comrade General, a Tiger can kill our T-34s at 1500 meters. We'd lose half our force just closing the distance. Which is precisely why we're changing our tactics, Vychutin replied. He unrolled a large diagram onto the Table A technical drawing of the Tiger with armor thickness marked at every angle. Petrov's team identified weak points. The side armor is 80 mm thick, but vulnerable to our 76 mm guns at close range. The rear armor is similarly vulnerable. The vision ports, the commander's cupola, the gun mantlet all potential targets. Major General Sergei Bogdanov, deputy commander of the 2nd Tank Army, leaned over the diagram. So we flank them. Use speed and maneuverability to get around the frontal armor. Exactly. The Tiger weighs 60 tons. It's slow to traverse the turret, slow to turn. Our T-34s are faster and more agile. We use that advantage. Captain Mikhail Korsunsky, an intelligence officer who'd interrogated captured German tank crews, added another dimension. Prisoners report the Tiger's transmission is unreliable. Maximum road speed is 23 miles per hour, but cross-country speed is much lower. They also mention the engine overheats frequently and requires extensive maintenance. Mechanical weaknesses, Vychutin noted. We exploit those too. Force them to maneuver over difficult terrain. Make them operate continuously without maintenance windows. The longer a Tiger stays in combat, the more likely it breaks down. But even as Vychutin outlined new tactics, he knew the grim reality. Tigers were appearing in battalion-strength formations companies of 10 to 15 tanks supported by infantry and other armor. Each one was a mobile fortress requiring multiple Soviet tanks to kill. The mathematics still favored the Germans. There's one more item, Vychutin said, pulling out a second document. The main armor directorate is fast-tracking production of the T-34-85. It will mount an 85 mm gun capable of engaging Tigers at effective ranges. First units should receive them by autumn. Autumn, Chistyakov repeated bitterly. And how many Tigers will the Germans field by then? How many of our tanks will they destroy while we wait for adequate weapons? No one answered. 200 kilometers to the north, the reality Chistyakov feared was already unfolding. March 7, 1943. Village of Oral, 350 kilometers southwest of Moscow. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Lavrinenko commanded a platoon of 3 T-34 tanks assigned to the 3rd Guards Tank Brigade. At 24 years old, he'd been fighting since the first days of Barbarossa, had survived the defense of Moscow and the brutal winter counteroffensive. He'd destroyed 7 German tanks in 2 years, mostly Panzer IIIs and a few Panzer IVs. But he'd never faced a Tiger. The morning fog was just lifting when Lavrinenko's radio crackled. Voke 1, this is Hammer. Enemy armor advancing on your position from the west. Heavy tanks. Repeat, heavy tanks. Through his periscope, Lavrinenko scanned the tree line 800 meters away. For several seconds, he saw nothing. Then movement, massive shapes emerging from the forest, their angular hulls painted in winter camouflage. Mother of God, his gunner, Sergeant Pavel Antonov, whispered. Those are Tigers. 3 of them, advancing in line abreast with infantry following. They moved slowly, deliberately, their long 88mm guns sweeping from side to side. Behind Lavrinenko's position, the village of Oral contained a field hospital and supply depot, a strategic target the Germans clearly intended to recapture. Voke 2, Voke 3, Lavrinenko transmitted to his other tanks. Enemy Tigers at 800 meters, bearing 270. Fall back to secondary positions. We use the briefing tactics, flanking attacks, close-range engagement. But theory and practice were different animals. The lead Tiger spotted Lavrinenko's platoon immediately. Its turret traversed with mechanical precision, the 88mm gun locking onto Voke 3, Lieutenant Boris Markov's tank. The muzzle flash was enormous, and a second later, Markov's T-34 exploded in a catastrophic ammunition detonation. The turret flew 15 feet into the air before crashing back down. "Move! Move!" Lavrinenko screamed. His driver threw the T-34 into reverse, backing rapidly toward the prepared positions behind a low ridge. Vogue 2 was already moving, its commander having the sense to retreat before becoming the next target. The Tigers continued their advance, unhurried, confident. They knew Soviet tanks couldn't hurt them at this range. "We need to get behind them," Lavrinenko said, studying his tactical map. "There's a ravine 400 meters north. We can use it for concealment, circle around, hit them from the side." It took 10 minutes to maneuver into position, 10 minutes during which the Tigers advanced another 300 meters, methodically destroying 2 more T-34s that had tried to engage from long range. Lavrinenko's radio filled with desperate calls for artillery support, airstrikes, anything to stop the German advance. Finally, Lavrinenko's tank emerged from the ravine at a right angle to the German line, 250 meters from the nearest Tiger. This close, he could see details: the spare track links on the hull, the commander's cupola, the infantry crouched behind the tank for cover. "Target left, side armor," Lavrinenko ordered. "Load armor piercing." "Loaded." Antonov responded. "Fire." The 76mm gun cracked. Through the periscope, Lavrinenko saw the round strike the Tiger's side armor just behind the turret ring. Sparks flew, but the tank didn't stop. Its turret began traversing toward them. "Hit it again. Again." Antonov fired as fast as the loader could feed rounds. At 250 meters, the 76mm armor-piercing shells struck with good penetrating power, but the Tiger's 80mm side armor was proving just as resilient as Petrov's report had warned. 2 hits, 3, for the Tiger's side was scarred with impact craters, but it remained operational. Then the Tiger's gun locked onto Lavrinenko's position. "Reverse. Get us out of here." The driver slammed the T-34 into reverse, but they weren't fast enough. The 88mm gun fired, and the world exploded. The round punched through the T-34's frontal armor like tissue paper, passed through the fighting compartment, and exited through the rear plate. The gunner was killed instantly. The loader lost his right arm. Lavrinenko was thrown against the turret wall, his vision filled with stars. Fire erupted in the engine compartment. Lavrinenko grabbed the loader corporal Yevgeny Petrov. A kid from Smolensk and dragged him toward the hatch. Behind them, the driver and radio operator were also evacuating, the driver's uniform on fire. They tumbled out of the tank and ran, just before the ammunition cooked off and the T-34 became a funeral pyre. From a ditch 200 meters away, Lavrinenko watched the Tigers continue their advance. Vogue 2 had managed to retreat to safety, but his own tank and Markov's were burning. The tactical doctrine from Kubinka looked perfect on paper: flank the Tiger, hit the side armor at close range, achieve kill shots. In reality, even the side armor at 250 meters had absorbed 4 hits before the Tiger turned and destroyed them. The face-hardened steel, the clever armor layout, the sheer thickness of plate, it all combined to create a tank that was nearly indestructible in a conventional engagement. Artillery finally arrived 15 minutes later, 122mm howitzers firing from positions 5 kilometers away. One Tiger took a direct hit and caught fire, the crew bailing out. The other 2 withdrew under the artillery barrage, mission incomplete but largely unscathed. That evening, Lavrinenko reported to his brigade commander, Colonel Andrei Kravchenko. The colonel listened in silence as Lavrinenko described the engagement: the devastating long-range accuracy of the 88mm gun, the ineffectiveness of the 76mm rounds even against side armor, the speed with which the Tigers had destroyed 3 T-34s. "We did everything the doctrine said," Lavrinenko finished. "Flanking attack, close range, side armor. We hit that Tiger at least 4 times. It didn't stop." Kravchenko poured 2 glasses of vodka and pushed one across his desk. "The doctrine isn't wrong, Dmitri. But it's incomplete. You hit 1 Tiger with 1 tank. The doctrine assumes concentrated fire 3, 4, 5 tanks all shooting simultaneously at the same target. That's how you achieve the 10 hits Kubinka documented. So we need 5 tanks to kill 1 Tiger." Lavrinenko asked bitterly. At minimum. Probably more, accounting for misses and tigers shooting back. Kravchenko downed his vodka. The Germans have quality. We have quantity. We trade 5 tanks for 1 tiger, and we win because we have 5,000 T-34s and they have 250 tigers. It was brutal arithmetic, but it was the reality of the Eastern Front in 1943. The Red Army would trade lives and equipment at ratios that would horrify Western armies, but ultimately grind down German numerical superiority through sheer attrition. Get some rest, Kravchenko said. I'm assigning you a new tank tomorrow. And Dmitri, the next time you face a tiger, bring friends. March 15, 1943. Nizhny Tagil, Central Russia. Alexander Morozov stood on the factory floor of production facility number 183, watching workers assemble the prototype of what would become the T-34-85. The new tank looked almost identical to the standard T-34, but the larger turret ring and the longer 85mm gun barrel made it distinctly different. We're adding 14 months to the production schedule, complained factory manager Yuri Maksarev, shouting over the noise of rivet guns and welding torches. We have to redesign the turret, retool half the assembly line, retrain the crews. And if we don't, Morozov shouted back, the Tigers will destroy every T-34 we build with the 76mm gun. We're not adding time to the schedule, we're ensuring we build tanks that can actually survive combat. The prototype's turret was larger, housing 3 crew members instead of 2, with improved optics and a turret traverse powered by the main engine. The 85mm gun was the same one being used in anti-aircraft roles, now modified for tank mounting. Petrov's tests at Kubinka had proven it could penetrate Tiger armor at 400 to 600 meters, not ideal, but better than the current situation. When can we begin production? Morozov asked. Full-scale production? November at the earliest. We can produce limited numbers, maybe 50 tanks by July for field trials. November. 7 months away. 7 months during which Tigers would continue killing T-34s at devastating ratios. Morozov walked around the prototype, mentally calculating improvements. The 85mm gun was good, but the Germans wouldn't stop with the Tiger. Intelligence reports suggested they were developing even heavier tanks vehicles that might make the Tiger look modest by comparison. Yuri, Morozov said, after we complete the T-34-85 production run, I want to start preliminary designs for a 100mm gun variant. 100mm. Maksarev looked shocked. That would require a completely new turret. Probably a new chassis. Then we build a new chassis. The Germans are escalating the tank war. We escalate with them, or we lose. April 20, 1943. Kubinka Proving Ground. Major Petrov stood before a classroom of 50 Soviet tank commanders, all of them summoned from frontline units for intensive training on Tiger engagement tactics. The course lasted 1 week and covered everything Petrov's team had learned from the captured Tiger. On the blackboard behind him, Petrov had drawn a detailed diagram showing the Tiger's weak points, or rather, its less strong points, since the tank had no truly weak spots. The lower glacis plate, Petrov said, pointing to the diagram, is still 100mm but angled slightly. A 76mm gun at 300 meters can sometimes penetrate here, though it's not reliable. The side armor is 80mm thick, but vulnerable to 76mm guns at ranges inside 400 meters. The rear armor is similarly 80mm and contains the engine compartment. A penetrating hit here will likely immobilize the tank. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Kuznetsov raised his hand. Comrade Major, what about the turret ring? I've heard it's vulnerable. A common misconception, Petrov replied. The turret ring is protected by overlapping armor plates. It's extremely difficult to hit even under ideal conditions. Don't count on it as a target. He clicked to the next slide, photographs from actual combat, showing destroyed Tigers. There weren't many. The Germans had become expert at recovering damaged tanks before Soviet forces could examine them. This Tiger was destroyed near Leningrad in February, Petrov said, pointing to a photo showing a burnt-out hulk. It took hits from a 152mm howitzer, multiple 76mm anti-tank guns, and close assault teams with satchel charges. The crew bailed out after the engine caught fire, and our infantry finished it with explosives. Total engagement time, 40 minutes. 40 minutes to kill one tank. The officers absorbed this soberly. The key, Petrov continued, is concentration of fire and multi-axis attacks. Never engage a Tiger alone. Never engage from one direction. Ideally, you want 3 or more tanks attacking simultaneously from different angles. The Tiger can only point its gun in one direction. While it's engaging your comrades, you flank and strike the side armor. And if we don't have 3 tanks available, asked Captain Mikhail Baryshev, a veteran of the Stalingrad fighting, then you withdraw and wait for support. I know that sounds like cowardice, but it's tactical sense. A single T-34 against a Tiger is a waste of a tank and crew. 3 T-34s against a Tiger is a fight you can win. Petrov spent the next hour going through case studies successful Tiger kills and failed engagements. The pattern was clear. Soviet forces won when they used coordinated tactics, overwhelming numbers, and terrain to their advantage. They lost when they fought Tigers on the Germans' terms long-range gunnery duels in open terrain. One final point, Petrov said as the lecture concluded. The Tiger is a superb weapon, but it's not invincible. It breaks down frequently. It gets stuck in mud. It runs out of fuel. The crews are human and make mistakes. Your job isn't to outduel a Tiger, it's to create conditions where the Tiger's advantages don't matter. Use forests where they can't see you at long range. Use villages where they can't maneuver. Use rivers and marshes where they get bogged down. Think of the Tiger as a problem to solve, not a monster to fear. After the lecture, Kuznetsov approached Petrov privately. Comrade Major, permission to speak candidly. Granted. Everything you've taught us is correct. But it still comes down to this: we'll lose multiple tanks to kill each Tiger. The ratios are against us. Petrov nodded slowly. You're right. But here's what you need to understand, Lieutenant. The Germans have maybe 300 Tigers deployed across the entire Eastern Front. We're producing 1,200 T-34s every month. Yes, we'll take losses. Heavy losses. But we can replace them. The Germans can't. Every Tiger we destroy is irreplaceable. Every T-34 we lose is back in production within weeks. That's how we win, not by matching their technology, but by overwhelming their numbers. It was cold comfort, but it was the truth. The Soviet Union would pay for victory in blood and steel, trading lives at ratios that would seem obscene to future historians. But the arithmetic worked. The Tigers would kill hundreds, perhaps thousands of Soviet tanks. But the Red Army would keep coming, wave after wave, until the last Tiger was surrounded and destroyed. Get back to your unit, Petrov said. Teach your crews what you've learned here. And remember, the Tiger shocked us because we weren't prepared. Now we are. The doctrine has changed. We've adapted. The Germans might have the better tank, but we have the better army. Kuznetsov saluted and departed, leaving Petrov alone in the empty classroom. On the blackboard, the Tiger diagram stared back at him: 102 mm of frontal armor, 80 mm sides, face-hardened steel, precision German engineering. It had taken 10 shells to crack that armor. 10 direct hits to kill one tank. But the Red Army was learning. And once the T-34-85 entered production, once the 100 mm guns were deployed, once the new tank destroyers rolled off assembly lines, the odds would shift. The Tiger had shocked the Soviets. Now it was time to shock the Germans right back. July 5, 1943. Kursk salient, 450 kilometers south of Moscow. The Battle of Kursk would become the largest tank engagement in history, and Captain Dmitry Lavrinenko, promoted and given command of a tank company after surviving the March engagement, now found himself at the center of it. His 9 T-34s were dug into defensive positions on the northern shoulder of the salient, hull down behind earthen berms with only their turrets exposed. Intelligence had warned them. The Germans were coming with everything they had. Panthers. Tigers. Ferdinand tank destroyers. An armored fist designed to punch through Soviet lines and encircle entire armies. Lavrinenko, this is brigade, his radio crackled at 5 o'clock hours. Enemy armor spotted, bearing 310, range 3,000 meters. Multiple heavy tanks confirmed. Through his periscope in the pre-dawn gloom, Lavrinenko saw them Tigers, at least 8 of them, advancing in a wedge formation with Panzer IVs on the flanks and infantry following in half-tracks. The ground trembled with the weight of 60-ton machines grinding forward across the steppe. "All units, hold fire," Lavrinenko ordered. "Let them close to 800 meters. Artillery, are you ready?" "Artillery ready," came the response from the Katyusha rocket launcher battery positioned 2 kilometers behind his line. Awaiting fire mission. This was the new doctrine in practice. Don't engage Tigers at long range where they held every advantage. Let them advance into a killing zone where Soviet numbers, prepared positions, and concentrated firepower could overwhelm German technological superiority. At 1,000 meters, the Tigers began firing. Their 88mm guns boomed, high explosive shells airbursting above the Soviet trenches. Infantry crouched deeper into their foxholes. But the T-34s remained hidden, engines cold, waiting. 800 meters. The Tigers kept coming, confident in their armor. Artillery, fire mission coordinates already plotted. Saturate the enemy approach. 5 seconds later, the world erupted. 40 Katyusha rockets screamed overhead, their distinctive wail earning them the German nickname Stalin's organs. The barrage landed directly among the advancing German infantry, half-tracks exploding in balls of flame. The Tigers buttoned up, their commanders ducking inside and closing hatches, suddenly blind except for narrow vision slits. "Now! All tanks, engage at will. Target the Tigers." 9 T-34s opened fire simultaneously. Lavrinenko's gunner, a replacement named Sergeant Boris Sokolov, targeted the lead Tiger. On target. Fire. At 800 meters, the 76mm armor-piercing round struck the Tiger's frontal armor and ricocheted skyward. But 8 other T-34s were also firing, and not all of them were aiming for the front. 2 tanks on Lavrinenko's left flank had sight lines to the Tiger sides as they advanced at an angle. One of those side shots connected. An 80mm armor plate at 700 meters, the conditions Petrov had identified as potentially lethal. The shell punched through, and the Tiger lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from its engine deck. "One down," someone shouted over the radio. But the Germans weren't helpless. The remaining Tigers spread out, their commanders quickly identifying the Soviet positions. Return fire was devastating. The T-34 to Lavrinenko's immediate right exploded in a shower of metal fragments, a direct hit from 700 meters that penetrated the frontal armor and detonated the ammunition. "Keep firing. Pourritondem." This was the arithmetic Petrov had calculated. Trade multiple Soviet tanks for each Tiger, but make every shot count. Create chaos, divide attention, exploit momentary exposure. A second Tiger took 3 hits in rapid succession, one frontal that left a crater but didn't penetrate, 2 side shots that punched through. Fire erupted from its turret hatches, and the crew bailed out, running for cover as machine gun fire from Soviet infantry positions cut them down. 2 Tigers down. Lavrinenko reported to brigade command. "We've lost 3 T-34s. Copy. Second company is moving to flank from the east. Hold your position." The engagement lasted 40 minutes. By the end, 4 Tigers had been destroyed or immobilized, but Lavrinenko's company had been reduced to 4 operational tanks. The exchange ratio better than the 5-to-1 Kravenko had predicted back in March, but still brutal. Yet as the German attack stalled and withdrew, Lavrinenko felt something unexpected. Not victory, but competence. The new tactics worked. The concentrated fire, the prepared positions, the artillery support, all of it combined to neutralize the Tigers' advantages. They were no longer shocked by the German supertank. They knew how to fight it. And more importantly, they knew they could win. August 12, 1943. Factory number 183, Nizhny Tagil. Alexander Morozov stood beside the production line as the first operational T-34-85 rolled off the assembly floor. The tank gleamed under the factory lights, its new three-man turret giving it a distinctly different profile from the standard T-34. The 85mm gun barrel extended nearly a meter longer than the old 76mm, promising the penetrating power Soviet tankers desperately needed. First production model, factory manager Maksarev announced, pride evident in his voice. We're 6 weeks ahead of schedule. Morozov walked around the tank, inspecting welds, checking clearances, running his hand along the gun barrel. This wasn't just an improved T-34, it was the Red Army's answer to the Tiger, designed specifically based on the lessons learned at Kubinka and in combat throughout the spring and summer. The crews will love the extra space in the turret, Morozov observed. 3 men means the commander can actually command instead of loading shells. And the gun? Maksarev asked. Petrov's tests proved the 85mm can penetrate Tiger frontal armor at 600 meters. At 400 meters, it's almost guaranteed. The crews will have a fighting chance now. A fighting chance. That's what this was really about. The T-34-85 wouldn't outclass the Tiger. German engineering was still superior in terms of armor thickness and gun performance. But it would allow Soviet tank crews to engage Tigers at reasonable combat ranges without needing suicidal close approach tactics. Production target? Morozov asked. We're ramping up to 500 per month by January 1944. Every T-34 rolling off the line after December will be the 85mm variant. 500 tanks per month. By the spring of 1944, thousands of T-34-85S would be deployed across the Eastern Front, fundamentally changing the balance of armored warfare. The Germans would still have Tigers and their new Panther tanks, but they'd no longer have an insurmountable technological advantage. There's something else, Maksarev said, leading Morozov to a separate workshop area. Based on your recommendation, we've begun preliminary work on the T-44 design. Completely new chassis, lower profile, improved armor layout. We're designing it around a 100mm gun. Morozov studied the wooden mock-up in the workshop A tank that looked more modern than anything currently in service, with sloped armor optimized for deflection rather than just thickness. This was the future, a tank designed from the ground up to incorporate every lesson learned from fighting Tigers. When can we have a prototype? Late 1944 at the earliest. Production in 1945. By then, Morozov thought, the war might be over. Or the Germans might have fielded even heavier tanks, continuing the spiral of technological escalation. Either way, the Red Army would be ready. October 3, 1943. Kubinka Proving Ground. Major Petrov watched as the first production T-34-85 underwent firing trials against captured German armor. On the range sat the frontal armor plate from the Tiger they'd tested back in February, scarred, battered, but still intact enough to serve as a target. The T-34-85's commander, Senior Lieutenant Alexei Morozov, the same officer who'd driven the captured Tiger out of the frozen bog 9 months earlier, sighted carefully through the improved optics. Range, 600 meters. Target, Tiger frontal armor. Ready to fire. Fire! Petrov ordered. The 85mm gun cracked, its report sharper and louder than the old 76mm. The armor-piercing round crossed 600 meters in just over a second and struck the test plate dead center. The shell punched through. A cheer went up from the observing officers. Petrov allowed himself a rare smile. At 600 meters double the effective range of the 76mm gun, the T-34-85 could now engage Tigers with a realistic chance of penetration. The arithmetic had shifted. Again, Petrov ordered. I want 5 shots to confirm consistency. They fired 5 more rounds. 4 penetrated cleanly. 1 ricocheted, the result of striking an existing impact crater at a bad angle. An 80% penetration rate at 600 meters, vastly better than the old doctrine that required closing to 200 to 300 meters. Captain Kravchenko approached with updated calculations. If we assume 3T-34-85S engaging 1 Tiger simultaneously at 600 meters, probability of kill within 10 rounds is approximately 85%. At 400 meters, it jumps to 95%. And our loss ratio? Estimated 2T-34-85s lost for every Tiger killed, assuming the Tiger is getting return shots. That's down from 5 to 1 with the old 76mm gun. 2 to 1. Still not parity, but sustainable. The Red Army could accept those losses and continue advancing. More importantly, it meant German Tigers were no longer the invincible fortress tanks that had shocked Soviet commanders in January. When does the 1st Combat Unit receive these? Petrov asked. The 38th Tank Brigade gets the initial production run next week. 50 tanks. If field trials confirm our testing, full deployment begins in January. Petrov looked at the perforated armor plate on the range, then at the T-34-85 sitting quietly with its engine idling. 9 months. That's how long it had taken the Soviet Union to respond to the Tiger shock. 9 months of desperate fighting, brutal losses, and frantic industrial mobilization. But they'd done it. They'd analyzed the problem, developed new tactics, redesigned their primary battle tank, and begun deployment of a weapon that could fight the Tiger on more equal terms. Write this up for the training bulletin, Petrov told Kravchenko. Every tank commander needs to know what the 85mm can do, and more importantly, what it can't do. The Tiger is still dangerous. We just have better tools to fight it now. December 15, 1943. Red Army Headquarters, Moscow. Colonel-General Voronov reviewed the year-end report on Tiger encounters with a mixture of satisfaction and sobering realism. The document was 300 pages long, compiled from combat reports, intelligence assessments, and technical analysis. The statistics told the story. Tigers deployed on Eastern Front, approximately 250. Tigers destroyed by Soviet forces, 87. Soviet tanks lost in engagements involving Tigers, approximately 1,200. The exchange ratio had improved from the disastrous early encounters. They were now trading about 14 tanks for every Tiger destroyed, down from earlier estimates of 20 or more. But it was still a painful number. The good news, said Lieutenant Colonel Chesnikov, Voronov's chief ordnance officer, is that Tiger deployment has peaked. The Germans can't produce them fast enough to replace losses. Meanwhile, our T-34-85 production is ramping up, and we're deploying new 100mm anti-tank guns to infantry divisions. And the Germans' new tanks? Voronov asked. The Panther is actually more concerning than the Tiger. It's faster, more reliable, and they're producing it in larger numbers. But our 85mm gun can handle it at reasonable ranges. We're adapting. Adapting. That word captured the entire Soviet response to the Tiger shock. They hadn't panicked. They hadn't surrendered. They'd studied the problem, implemented solutions, and continued fighting. The initial shock had transformed into grim determination. Voronov walked to the situation map where the front lines were marked in colored pins. Since Kursk in July, the Red Army had been advancing steadily westward. The Tigers had inflicted terrible casualties, but they hadn't stopped the Soviet advance. Nothing had stopped it. The Americans are asking about our experience with Tigers, Chesnikov mentioned. They're worried about facing them in France when they finally open the second front. Tell them what we learned, Voronov replied. Don't fight them alone. Don't fight them at long range. Use numbers, coordination, and better weapons. The Tiger is a superb machine, but it's still just a machine. It can be killed. It had taken 10 shells to prove that point at Kubinka back in February. 10 direct hits on a stationary target under perfect conditions. In combat, the numbers were different, sometimes better, often worse, always unpredictable. But the lesson remained: the Tiger could be killed. It required sacrifice, tactics, and determination, but it could be done. January 18, 1944. Exactly 1 year after the capture. Major Petrov stood in the museum building at Kubinka, where the original captured Tiger now sat on permanent display. The tank had been partially restored after the destructive testing, its battle scars left visible as testimony to what it had endured. School groups and military trainees regularly visited, learning the Tiger's history. Petrov often served as guide, walking them through the story of that frozen January morning when Soviet soldiers first laid eyes on the monster that would change their war. This tank, Petrov would tell each group, taught us that technological superiority isn't everything. Yes, the Germans built a better tank. But we built a better army. We adapted. We learned. We overcame. He'd point to the impact craters on the frontal armor, each one numbered and catalogued. These represent every weakness we found, every lesson we learned, every improvement we made to our own forces. The Germans shocked us with this machine. We responded by becoming harder to shock. Young officers would ask the inevitable question, how many shells did it really take to destroy a tiger? And Petrov would give the honest answer, in testing, we counted 10 penetrating hits before achieving complete destruction. In combat, it varies. Sometimes one lucky shot kills it. Sometimes 20 shots aren't enough. The real answer is, as many as it takes. You keep shooting until it stops moving. As the sun set over Kubinka on that anniversary evening, Petrov walked alone to the tiger one final time. He placed his hand on the cold metal, remembering the shock he'd felt when it first arrived. The disbelief that the Germans had built something so formidable. The fear that Soviet forces couldn't stop it. But they had stopped it. Through sacrifice and adaptation, through better tactics and better weapons, through sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. The Tiger had been a terrible opponent, but it had also been a teacher. And the Red Army had been an excellent student. The cost had been high, thousands of tanks destroyed, tens of thousands of soldiers killed. But the lessons learned at Kubinka and on battlefields across the Eastern Front had fundamentally transformed Soviet armor doctrine. The shock of the Tiger's armor had forced innovation, accelerated weapons development, and created tactical approaches that would serve the Red Army for the remainder of the war. By war's end, the Soviets would field tanks that matched or exceeded the Tiger's capabilities: the IS-2 heavy tank with its 122mm gun, the T-34 Ch-85 in massive numbers, the Su-100 tank destroyer with its powerful 100mm gun. The technological gap would close, and then reverse. But it all began here, Petrov reflected, at a frozen proving ground in February 1943, with a captured Tiger and the shocking realization that it took 10 shells to crack its armor. 10 shells to kill a Tiger. That number had entered Soviet military doctrine, been taught to every tank commander, shaped the design of new weapons and new tactics. It represented both the challenge the Germans had posed and the determination with which the Soviets had responded. As darkness fell, Petrov returned to his office to write his final report of the year. The war would continue for another 16 months, but the Tiger was no longer shocking. It was understood, respected, and most importantly, defeated. The Germans had built a fortress on tracks. The Soviets had learned to storm it. And in that learning, they had ensured their victory.